The parlor had the air of a room that had seen more than its share of winter evenings, the kind where lamplight fell softly on crocheted lace and heavy curtains shut out the world beyond the frosted glass. It was a respectable room, a little old-fashioned, but orderly in the manner of households that kept to their traditions. Upon the stiff, backed chair in the corner lay the antimacassar, a delicate thing of white thread, its pattern worked by patient hands now long at rest. The house itself seemed to breathe around it, the floorboards creaking with memory, the shadows in the corners gathering at dusk as though they had voices of their own. Ellen Markham prided herself on keeping the place just as her mother had left it. She dusted every sill, shook out the rugs, polished the brass until it gleamed. Yet she did not often touch the antimacassar. It was not that she feared so simple an article, but rather that her hand hesitated of its own accord, as though warned away by some whisper too low for thought. Guests sometimes remarked on its beauty, and she would nod and speak of her mother's skill, though her eyes betrayed the faintest unease, a flicker that passed before she remembered herself. When the house grew still, and the ticking of the clock seemed louder than the breath of the living, she would glance toward that corner and wonder why the piece of lace appeared so insistently present, as though it were more than thread and needlework. Her brother Stephen, who came to visit after years away at his practice in the city, laughed at her for the sentiment. He declared it nonsense, a relic of the small-town imagination. But even as he spoke, his gaze lingered a moment too long upon the chair. It was as if the delicate threads wove more than a pattern. They drew the eye into their intricate circles and loops, leading the mind into paths one had not meant to follow. When he turned away, he did so abruptly, with the brisk air of a man who has dismissed something troubling. Life in the Markham house went on much as it always had. Ellen kept her routines. The neighbors dropped in with baskets of preserves or the latest morsels of gossip. Yet more than once, as twilight deepened, she found herself listening for sounds that should not have been there. A soft stirring in the corner, like fabric shifting without cause. A faint sigh, as though the chair's cushions remembered a weight no longer seated upon them. She told herself it was only the house settling, the familiar groan of timbers, the draft creeping through the chimney. But when she looked again, the antimacassar seemed subtly altered, as if its folds had rearranged themselves into a new design, one not quite so innocent as before. Stephen dismissed her concerns. He stayed only a week, and during that time he slept heavily in the guest chamber, never waking to the noises that made her heart race. He had little patience for superstition. Yet on the morning of his departure, he paused in the doorway and turned back, his face strangely serious. "Keep that lace in the sunlight," he said suddenly, as though the thought had burst from him unbidden. Ellen started to ask what he meant, but he waved it off with a laugh and was gone before she could press him further. She stood in the hall long after the echo of his footsteps had faded, her mind troubled by the odd advice. The days shortened as autumn crept toward winter. The evenings grew chill, and she lit the fire earlier, grateful for the warmth, though the flames threw restless shapes upon the walls. She grew accustomed to the presence in the parlor, if accustomed is the right word for a thing one accepts but never welcomes. It was not constant. There were days when the lace seemed no more than cloth, pale and fragile, with nothing remarkable about it. But then there were evenings when the light touched it in a way that made it glow faintly, as though a secret radiance lay beneath the weave. On those nights, she avoided the chair altogether, sitting instead near the hearth with her sewing, her eyes fixed upon her work though her thoughts strayed continually toward that corner. Once, the neighbor girl Clara came to help with the mending. She was a bright creature, full of laughter, her hands quick and skillful. She noticed the antimacassar at once, exclaiming at its fine stitches, and before Ellen could stop her she reached to lift it. A cry escaped Ellen's lips, sharp and involuntary, startling them both. Clara dropped her hand back into her lap, her eyes wide. "I beg your pardon," she murmured, though there was a look in her face as if she too had felt a small shock at the touch of the lace. She did not mention it again, but her chatter grew more subdued. And when she left that evening, she glanced toward the parlor with a puzzled frown, as though something lingered in her thoughts that she could not quite name. So the house went on, day after day, its silence deepening as the first snow lay white upon the fields. The antimacassar remained in its place, waiting, watching, if such words could be applied to an object so inanimate. Ellen told herself it was fancy, the result of solitude, of the long hours when shadows crept into corners and the mind grew restless. Yet in her heart she knew the truth was something other, something she dared not speak aloud. The house was not hers alone. It belonged also to that fragile square of lace, and whatever hand had guided its making had left more than thread behind. The winter settled harshly upon the countryside, wrapping the Markham house in a silence deeper than the drifts that smothered the hedgerows. Within, the fire crackled in the hearth, though its comfort seemed somehow thin against the chill that breathed from the parlor corner. Ellen grew used to carrying her lamp carefully past the antimacassar. Averting her eyes from the delicate loops of lace lest she fall again into that strange fascination it inspired. Yet no amount of determination could keep her from noticing how the thing seemed alive to the play of light, brightening when the wick flared, dimming when the flame guttered, like a breathing creature made of thread. At first, the signs were trifling. A rustle that stirred the still air when no draught stirred the curtains. A faint impression upon the cushion of the chair, as though someone had risen a heartbeat before she entered. Once, she was sure she smelled lavender in the room, a fragrance her mother had favored, though no sachets remained in the cupboards. She told herself these were the tricks of memory, the senses weaving illusions to ease the loneliness of long evenings. But when the clock chimed midnight and she rose to snuff the lamp, she glanced back and saw the antimacassar quiver slightly, the motion subtle as breath. She stood frozen, her hand clutched tight around the taper, until the lace lay still once more. In that instant, she knew with dreadful certainty that her solitude was no longer her own. Days followed in which nothing occurred. The lace lay limp and innocent, a mere ornament upon the chair. Ellen almost persuaded herself she had imagined it. Yet the quiet hours of dusk held their own testimony. One evening as she stitched a hem, she heard the soft sound of thread pulling, the minute rasp of needle through cloth. She looked up sharply, but her hands lay idle in her lap, and across the room the antimacassar glimmered faintly. Its pattern seemed to shift before her eyes, as though invisible fingers worked ceaselessly at some design beyond her comprehension. Her pulse hammered, and she forced herself to whisper aloud, if only to anchor her courage, that it was nothing but shadow and fancy. But even as the words left her lips, the faintest snip rang out, like shears closing on a thread. Sleep grew restless. In dreams she wandered the parlor, reaching for the chair only to find it occupied by a figure she could not see, veiled entirely in white lace that wound about its head and shoulders. She would wake trembling, the echoes of muffled breathing still in her ears. By morning she was weary, her eyes shadowed, and she told herself sternly that she must not allow dreams to rule her waking life. Yet when she descended the stairs, the antimacassar seemed to greet her, its folds freshly arranged, though she had not touched it. The neighbors began to notice her pallor. Mrs. Hale, bustling and kindly, pressed Ellen to take more broth, more rest, more company. Ellen accepted politely, but offered no explanation. What could she say? That she was haunted by a scrap of lace. They would think her mad. Even Clara, bright-eyed and curious, had ceased to ask after the Antimacassar, though Ellen sometimes caught her staring uneasily at the parlor door, as though she too felt the hush that lay upon that room. And always, when guests departed, Ellen returned to find the Antimacassar somehow waiting for her, its white surface faintly gleaming as if with satisfaction. The turning of the year brought storms. One wild night, with wind shrieking at the shutters, Ellen sat close by the fire, too nervous to attempt her bed. The lamp sputtered as the draught pressed against the chimney. She felt the old fear growing, that peculiar pressure in the air that warned her of something more than weather. Then she heard it, soft at first, then louder. A whispering murmur, as of threads drawn tight, of cloth crumpling beneath invisible weight. She rose and stood transfixed, watching the Antimacassar stir as though unseen hands plucked at it. Slowly, inexorably, it slid down the back of the chair and folded itself upon the seat. Ellen gasped and clutched the mantel for support, her eyes fixed upon that slight, purposeful motion. The fire leapt high in the grate, throwing sudden light across the lace, and she saw with terror that its pattern was no longer the same. Where once neat loops and flowers twined, now dark shapes interlaced, suggesting faces with hollow eyes and mouths stretched wide in soundless cries. She shrank back, pressing her hand against her lips to smother the scream that rose there. A log broke in the fire with a crack, and at the sound the Antimacassar stilled, its design once more innocent, harmless. Ellen sank into a chair, trembling, and whispered prayers until exhaustion claimed her. But though her head drooped and her eyes closed, she knew the house no longer belonged wholly to her. It had opened itself to something she dared not name, something that had chosen the fragile net of lace for its dwelling. The days that followed wore a sameness that was almost a cruelty, for sameness invites the mind to measure what shifts beneath the surface. Ellen rose, tended to her tasks, spoke pleasantly to the neighbors who still came while the roads were passable, and yet at every turn a small dislocation met her. A thing put aside that should have lain where she left it, a draught that breathed from a window tight-latched, a whisper of texture beneath her fingertips when her hand drifted too near the parlor chair. In the early light the Antimacassar lay with the meek air of household trifles, but toward dusk its whiteness took on depth, as if thread were the thinnest skin stretched over something intent on rising. Clara returned once with a basket of eggs and a ribbon she had purchased in town, a little trifle she hoped would brighten Ellen's bonnet against the bleakness. She tried with brave spirit to fill the rooms with chatter, to tell of Mrs. Hale's cousin who had slipped on the steps of the church, and of Tom Bell's new colt that refused the halter. But talk thins when the air itself is listening. Twice Clara's voice faltered and her eyes wandered to the parlor doorway. Ellen kept the door near too, just enough to keep the room from looking like a mouth set open for a cry. They sat in the kitchen and sipped tea that had no strength, and when Clara rose to go, the girl reached impulsively for Ellen's hand, as if gratitude demanded it, as if a friend's touch might mend some secret tear. Ellen felt the faintest brush of thread against her wrist, a silken pressure that had no business upon living skin. She did not snatch away. She merely held her breath until the feeling passed, and she walked with Clara to the gate where the snow lay thin and old and gray. Nights lengthened. Twice she dreamed of her mother. Not the sweet remembrance of old comfort, but a stern image seated with her back to the fire, hair plaited close, hands poised in her lap, and over the dark of her dress lay the white square, the pattern drawn sharp by some unearthly radiance, each loop a narrow eye, each knot a small tight mouth. Ellen would call from the threshold, and the figure would not turn, only lean her head ever so slightly as if listening to a distant sound beneath the creak of the beams and the pop of the sap in the burning logs. It was a sound Ellen could not bear to name in the dream, a little rhythmic susurrus like breathing through lace. She woke as if surfacing through cold water, her throat dry, the taste of ash at the back of her tongue. She took to moving the lamp whenever she entered the parlor, placing it deliberately so its light fell from an angle that left the Antimacassar plain and patternless. The more direct the light, the more the figure in the net declared itself, not in any gross manner, but through the addition of tiny certainties, a twist that was not there yesterday, a flower whose petals had knit closer until they suggested a mouth pursed in concentration, a stem that had curved almost imperceptibly into the shape of a shoulder beneath a shawl. If she stared too long, she felt the familiar tug in the depths of her sight, a little drawing inward, as if the center of the lace were a drain pulling her gaze toward it. She could shake off the feeling by blinking or stepping away, but the moment of surrender it demanded was becoming familiar enough to frighten her. Once, when a thaw came and rain whispered against the panes of full day and night, she set her mind to banishing folly and took the Antimacassar into her hands. It was cool and fine, far stronger than its delicacy suggested, and the pattern under her fingertips seemed to shift with the slightest change in pressure, as if the thread were eager for the path her touch might allow. She carried it to the kitchen, laid it upon a towel, and dabbed at it with warm water and a drop of soap. Such things, she told herself firmly, gather dust, and dust holds the breath of old rooms. It is the dust that troubles, not the thread. She rinsed and pressed the water from it, and took it up to the attics where there was space and air. She fastened a length of clean cord from rafter to rafter and spread the lace upon it to dry, smoothing the edges carefully until the whole hung pliant and bright like a white square of evening light, caught and made patient. The attic was the place where her childhood had hoarded itself. A trunk with a broken lock kept a confusion of dolls and a scrap of a red cloak and a handful of buttons that no longer matched anything. A cradled mirror leaned against the slope of the roof, its quicksilver dimmed, reflecting the widened room of attics where rooms should not be. Ellen lingered longer than she meant to. Something about removing the Antimacassar had lightened the downstairs air, and the attic now shared a hush that was almost agreeable. She peered from the small north window across a world of roofs and bare trees and thought of her brother at his city practice of letters with brisk, affectionate lines and little time between them. She told herself she would leave the lace to dry entirely before returning it to its place. Then she would put it back without the dread she had allowed to grow about it. There would be no room for phantoms in a house managed with sense. At last she descended. The house accepted her movement with familiar wood, voices, and the glossy witnesses of the framed portraits in the hall. She took up her mending in the parlor because she would not be driven from it. The chair in the corner looked smaller without its adornment, a little shorn, the green of the fabric dulled where the sun had not reached. She mended 2 seams and laid aside the third, having pricked her finger and stained the thread. She went to the kitchen for a cloth, and when she returned the chill ran through her so quickly that her knees weakened. Upon the chair back lay a white square, damp still, its lower corner beaded with the slow drop of water that gathered and fell to the cushion. The cord in the attic was empty. There was nothing in the world more ordinary than a woman crossing her own parlor to lift a piece of lace she herself had washed and hung. And yet the strength it took to move those few steps seemed beyond the weight of her bones. She put out her hands, and the air between her and the chair had the yielding resistance of water. She took the Antimacassar, and it clung to her palms with the coolness of something living that has been removed too soon from its proper element. She carried it again to the kitchen, laid it again upon the towel, and stood very still until the beat of her heart answered the ticking of the clock above the stove. She did not climb to the attic this time. Instead, she opened the back door and let the January rain drift in to veil the threshold. She held the lace up to the weather, and the rain fell through it, as if through a net meant to catch only what is lighter than water. When she brought it back and wrung it gently, a scent rose that was not soap, not dust, not lavender or cedar or any common thing. It was faint as the memory of snow and sharp as iron in the mouth, and beneath it was the thin sweetness of a room where illness has kept too long a vigil. She slept poorly. Toward morning, she woke from a tangle of dreams in which she had stitched a shroud from the Antimacassar and could never find the end of the thread. She went first to the kitchen, where she had left it, and found the towel neatly folded and dry. She told herself she had at last been wise in some waking hour and returned it where it belonged. Yet when she entered the parlor, the sight that met her was not comfort. The chair stood with its back toward the window, as it had always stood, and upon the back the lace lay in perfect order, except that the corner on the right side hung lower by an inch than it had ever done before. That inch was like a word spoken aloud in the wrong place. The pattern in that corner had drawn inward, a little whirlpool of thread whose center was darker than the rest, as if shadow had settled there. In the afternoon, Mrs. Hale came again, bustling, with a pot of soup and 3 turns of advice about the coal merchant. The older woman had tender feelings for Ellen, and more than once had considered the problem of a companion for her, but there were no widows of the right temperament, and no girls as steady as Clara who could be spared their own houses. She scolded gently about the damp and insisted the parlor fire was not as vigorous as it should be. Ellen allowed herself to be chided and went to stir the coal while Mrs. Hale raised the lamp chimney to trim the wick. Later, after the soup and the weather and the coal were all decided between them, Mrs. Hale paused at the door as if she had forgotten something. The look that crossed her stout face was not the look of a woman who doubts her memory. It was the look of a woman who feels a draught pass through the seams of her certainty. She patted Ellen's shoulder and said she would send over a few cuttings from her ivy, which would take nicely in a bowl of water on the parlor table. Then she glanced once more toward the corner, and her mouth tightened almost imperceptibly, as if against the taste of a word she would not speak in a friend's house. That evening, when the hour had come that most resembles confession, the hour when lamps are lit and the sound of the wick being turned up is louder than a footstep, Ellen sat on the low stool near the fire and tried to read. The lines blurred and a soft motion in the corner of her eye demanded notice. She refused it. She read again, though her lips had begun to move over the words like a child's. The motion came again. It was a small, steady action, the kind the mind can explain a dozen ways until explanation frays, and the thing itself remains. The hanging corner on the right lifted, held for a moment, then fell back as lightly as a sigh. In the span between lift and fall, the lace stretched just enough to show a crosswise tension, as if something behind it had stirred. She set the book aside and spoke the evening prayer aloud, not loudly, but with a clarity that drew the words into the fibers of the room. The prayer's last amen had scarcely left her when a minute clicking began, like the sound of a thimble's rim tapping a table. It came from the chair. Tap and hush, a measured cadence. She stood and the taps stopped. She sat and they resumed, but faster now, as if her quiet had given permission. She rose again and approached, one hand out, the other pressed hard to the side of her skirt. She bent and saw upon the seat a single hairpin, black, such as she had not worn since girlhood. It lay at the precise center of the cushion and moved a fraction with each small tap, though there was no visible cause. She reached and took it up. It was cold enough to sting her fingers. She closed her hand around it, and the instant of contact was followed by a sensation so intimate that she nearly cried out, a sensation of another palm closing lightly over hers in the mutual astonishment of touch. She retreated then, not with panic, but with careful dignity. She placed the pin upon the mantel as if setting down a piece from a game played with rules not yet learned. She considered the little item, and in a moment that cut through the fog of fear, she understood that to let the house arrange itself without her would be equal to an invitation. She took a shawl and moved the chair slightly, turning it less toward the window and more toward the hearth. She smoothed the lace and made the right corner even with the left, not settling for what the thing might prefer. The shadow in the pattern shifted and grew weaker in the new light, though it did not vanish entirely. A kind of stubborn will rose in her then, not anger, but a refusal to be counted absent in her own dwelling. She spoke to the empty air in an even, ordinary tone about the accounts she must settle and the mending that would be spoilt if left for another day. When she finished speaking, the room felt altered, like a child quieted by the sound of a calm voice. Sleep found her late and left her early. Toward dawn she heard the tread of feet on the stairs, as clear as the step of a known person who carries a candle and will not let the flame tremble. She lay very still and listened to each riser accept that weight, to each tread pass, to the hush upon the landing. The footfalls turned toward the attic. She was out of bed before she had formed the thought of rising. She wrapped herself and took her own candle, which burned with the earnest light of small conviction. And she climbed, counting as she had counted as a child, each stair a little harbor for courage. At the attic door she felt a pressure as of breath meeting breath. She set her hand to the latch and lifted. The attic lay under its low roof, familiar and false at once. The mirror on the floor held a small oval of candlelight, and the rest was shadow. The cord hung slack. The far window paled with the rumor of morning. She stood in the doorway, and the sense of another presence was so strong that she felt the old urge, the one that belongs to manners rather than to bravery, to incline her head by a degree and say, "You are here, then." She did not speak. She advanced exactly 3 steps. The air grew colder. She held the candle higher and in that sting of light saw, upon the floor beneath the cord, a scatter of fine white threads, not lint, not cobweb, but fresh snippings, as from a work just undertaken. Kneeling, she touched them and felt the smallest quiver, like the aftermath of a plucked string. The threads did not cling to her finger. They lay without weight and yet with a disposition, all of them turned minutely toward the stair, as if the house itself were a slow river and they had been set loose upon its surface. She gathered them onto a scrap of paper, folded them carefully, and for want of any better idea set them within the old trunk on top of the red cloak. She did not know why she kept them. She returned downstairs and placed the candle where the light would be of use. Her eyes went to the chair, and she could not stop them. The Antimacassar seemed no different, yet the sense of a thing accomplished lay upon the room. Whether accomplished by or upon, she could not tell. By noon, she felt the weariness that follows the fight for an inch. She went again to the mantel and took up the hairpin. She turned it over in her hand. Its head had a tiny notch, a flaw perhaps, or a telling. She took down the small jar where she kept matches and oddments and laid the pin within. She told herself, with that schoolmistress firmness a mind sometimes lends itself, that evidence belongs where it cannot wander. Through the window the sky lifted to a sullen brightness, and she went to the door to take in a little air. The porch boards offered their known complaints under her weight. Far off a cart creaked. A dog barked twice. Ordinary sounds, the kind that tie a soul back to the world. When she came in again, the jar that should have held the pin stood open. The pin lay across the rim, as neatly as if placed for display. She stared and then, refusing the shape of dread that would bloom from such a sight, she replaced the pin within the jar, twisted on the lid, and moved the jar to another shelf entirely. Half an hour later she checked. The lid was tight. The pin was inside, at the bottom, where gravity and sense insist such things remain. She laughed once, not merrily, but with a sound that acknowledged the line between fear and stubbornness, and she went about the rest of the day with a steadiness she did not wholly feel. That night, the wind changed. It came down from the north, a paired, clean wind that keened at the chimneys. The house answered with its thin repertoire of winter voices. She set extra kindling by the grate. She put out saucers of water in the corners, as her mother had taught her, a small old rite no one living could explain, only that it kept rooms sweet. Toward the last hour she found herself standing in the parlor, without knowing how she had chosen to stand there. The Antimacassar lay mild and white. The right corner hung even. The shadow at its center was only a rumor. She sat in the chair opposite and folded her hands as if at a sitting. In the stillness that followed, she became aware of a soft thread, drawn sound, very faint, not from the chair or the Antimacassar, but from beneath the floorboards. It had the feel of a thought half formed in a mind not her own. The house held its breath with her. The sound ceased. She could not say how long she remained in that quiet, only that when the clock chimed she rose, every motion deliberate, and drew the parlor door to. On the landing she paused, and in the faint passage of air from the crack beneath the door she smelled again that impossible scent, iron and sweetness together. Like a cut finger pressed to the tongue in a sick room where a lamp is always burning. She slept, if it may be called sleep, with one ear set toward the stairs. When morning came, she did not hurry to the parlor. She made tea and drank it while it cooled, and she wrote 3 lines to Stephen that said only that the weather was severe, and that the house kept her busier than she might like, and that she wished him health. She sealed the envelope and set it by the door to post. Then, as one goes to face a task known and unavoidable, she entered the parlor. The Antimacassar had acquired a new grace, if that is a word for dread arranged in beauty. The pattern seemed fuller, as if a hand had continued the design in the night and added a border that drew the eye inward in a slow, pleasant spiral. In the spiral's curve the suggestion of a shoulder had become certain, and the slope of a face had entered the world of recognition. Not the face itself, which was still a subtlety of curve and shadow, but the expectation of a face, which is sometimes more powerful than the thing desired. Ellen stood and let the shape make itself known within her. She did not allow herself the cowardice of doubt. It is a face, she told herself quietly, as one might acknowledge the birth of difficulty. It is not mine, and I do not give leave for it to be here. Then, because a house must be governed, and because living advances by ordinary acts, she fetched the ivy Mrs. Hale had sent and set it in a clear bowl of water, and placed it on the table between the chairs. The green tips rose bravely, as if nothing in the world ever wove shadow into whiteness. She trimmed the wick, set the lamp a little farther to the left, and opened the curtains to the dull morning. The lace received the new light, and in that receiving, changed again. It did not grow plainer. It expressed itself with more reserve, as creatures sometimes do when observed too closely. The face receded to the edge of belief. The right corner lifted once, a small movement of courtesy or farewell or warning. She went to fetch needle and thread, and as she turned her back the quiet tapped once from the seat of the chair. A single note that told her plainly she had not imagined anything at all. The deep of winter pressed harder upon the Markham house, and though Ellen strove to keep her thoughts to hearth and habit, the thing in the parlor was no longer content to remain a suggestion glimpsed in shadows. It began to move with intent, showing itself not only in the wavering of threads, but in the fabric of the household itself. The nights were never wholly dark now. Even when the lamps were turned down, there glowed from that corner a faint pallor, as though the Antimacassar held light in its net and released it slowly, like the breath of some hidden presence. Ellen told herself that to walk past the door without glancing in was a show of strength, but strength bends with repetition, and each time she passed, she felt the air thicken, urging her eyes to turn despite herself. One bitter evening, as the wind combed shrill fingers across the eaves, she heard the unmistakable sound of fabric tearing. She rushed into the parlor with her heart hammering, convinced some intruder had forced entry. The room lay empty, yet upon the antimacassar she saw one thread parted, curling at the edge like a broken vein. As she watched, the thread pulled itself taut again, closing the breach with a speed that mocked the slow labor of any human hand. The broken place vanished, and the pattern renewed itself, now bearing a curve that suggested the line of a jaw, pale and unyielding. She sank into the nearest chair and covered her face, unable to pray, for the words deserted her like frightened servants. After that night, the manifestations multiplied. A soft thud of footsteps circled the upstairs hall when the doors were all locked. The mirror in the attic clouded with breath, though no living mouth had neared it. More than once, Ellen entered the kitchen to find a cup or spoon laid in precise alignment upon the table, as though someone had measured angles unseen. The antimacassar was the heart of it, the fixed point to which all other strangeness returned. Its folds seemed to change with the hour, sometimes slack as sleep, sometimes drawn tight as if clutching secrets. Ellen avoided the chair by daylight, but when dusk spread, she felt compelled to enter the parlor, to sit across from it as if in audience, her body stiff with dread yet her will chained to attendance. Clara returned with her bright chatter dimmed. She brought a skein of yarn and suggested they knit together, for she had noticed Ellen's nerves and thought occupation might soothe them. They sat by the fire, needles clicking, and at first the rhythm brought a fragile comfort. Then Clara's eyes strayed to the antimacassar, and her hands faltered. Ellen followed her gaze and saw what Clara saw. The lace was no longer lace. It had gathered upon itself into a drapery, hanging lower than ever before, the design unmistakably that of a human form seated upright. The curve of shoulders, the slope of arms, the hollow suggestion of a throat. Clara made the sign of the cross and whispered that she must go at once. She left in haste, her yarn trailing behind her like a strand of web, and from that day she did not come again. Ellen did not blame her, though the absence weighed upon her heavier than the silence itself. Stephen wrote that he would try to visit again come spring, but spring was months away, and each letter seemed to come from a world untouched by what ruled hers. She did not dare confide the truth to him, for what could words convey of the sound she now heard each night? The faint rustle as of lace dragging itself across wood, the low moan like air pressed through fabric too tightly woven. She tried once to remove the antimacassar entirely. She rose early, steeled by the freshness of morning, and carried it to the stove. She thrust it in with trembling hands and pressed the iron poker against it. Yet the lace did not catch. The flames leapt around it, bright tongues licking but never consuming. She held it there until her arm ached, but when she drew it out, it was unscorched, gleaming with a whiteness cleaner than before. The smell that clung to her clothes was not smoke, but a sour sweetness, like lilies left too long in stagnant water. She dared not try again. Instead, she kept to her routines with a brittle resolve, as though ordinary tasks might hold back the tide. She scrubbed, she cooked, she wrote letters, she recited prayers. But always the parlor claimed her. The antimacassar had grown bold enough to stir in her presence. Once, as she sat sewing, the lace lifted itself, and settled across the chair, as if someone invisible had reclined there, adjusting their garment for comfort. Ellen dropped her work, her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time she spoke directly to it, whispering that it had no right. The air quivered, and the lace stilled, but in the stillness was victory, not retreat. The neighbors began to murmur. Mrs. Hale remarked that Ellen's eyes were shadowed, her step uncertain. Some whispered that solitude had broken her, that she spoke to things unseen. Yet they did not visit at night, when the truth might have touched them too. Ellen grew thin, her cheeks hollow, but her spirit clung stubbornly. She told herself that recognition of evil is not surrender to it, that her defiance was a wall. Yet each day the Antimacassar revealed itself more clearly, as if feeding on her attention. She could not look away for long without the sense that it leaned closer, waiting to claim what sight denied. One night the wind fell still, and the silence was so dense she could hear the crack of frost outside. She woke from uneasy slumber to a sound within the room, a sigh, long and low, drawn through cloth. She turned and saw at the foot of her bed the Antimacassar spread wide, its edges trembling as if lifted by unseen breath. It hovered there, white and cold, its pattern luminous in the moonlight. She froze, unable to scream. The lace bent toward her, its center darkening into the semblance of a face, eyes hollow, mouth stretching wide. She clutched the cross at her throat and forced the words of a prayer through her lips, broken and gasping. At the sound, the thing wavered, drew back, and with a sudden rush it folded upon itself and was gone. She found it in the morning, neatly laid upon the parlor chair, as though it had never stirred, its corners perfectly aligned. From that night forward, Ellen knew there could be no doubt. The Antimacassar was no lifeless ornament, but a vessel, a dwelling for some presence that mocked the boundary between the seen and unseen. She was bound to it now, as if the house itself had sworn her into service. Fear ruled her hours, fear so constant that it became a companion, whispering at her ear, hollowing her strength. Yet beneath the fear lay a grim determination, a will to endure until some path revealed itself. The Antimacassar had shown its face. In doing so, it had also declared itself an enemy. And Ellen, frail though she was, would not yield her house without resistance. The thaw began with a soft dripping at the corners of the eaves, a timid percussion that sounded like hope, but Ellen knew hope is only a light one carries to see what waits in the dark. She rose before first light and set about the work of war as best she understood it. She fetched the bowl of water from the parlor table and laid a pinch of salt within, letting the grains dissolve with the sober patience of one who has few weapons and will not squander them. She set the bowl beneath the chair as a sentry and stood back to measure what might change. The Antimacassar lay composed, its whiteness almost tender in the gray morning, yet the center held that quiet dimness like a pupil that does not contract. By the time the sun lifted, she had gathered what small defenses old women teach without naming their reasons. She opened every curtain in the house. She propped the parlor door so that the light fell straight and without mercy upon the chair. She moved the lamp to the far side where it would lend a second day to the first. Then she brought up the mirror from the attic, the oval one with the foxed glass that had held so many reflections that it seemed now to carry a faint image of any room it entered. She set it on the table opposite the chair so that the Antimacassar would be obliged to look upon itself. There was a staying of breath in the parlor as the mirror found the lace. The surface clouded and cleared, as if the glass had to remember how to hold this particular whiteness. The pattern sprang into another life in the reflection, refined and exact, without the soft forgiveness that fabric receives from air. Ellen leaned close and saw more plainly than ever the slope of a cheek, the curve of a shoulder drawn up as if from chill, the suggestion of fingers folded in a lap that had no weight to crease the cushion. Her stomach turned with a slow revolt, not of disgust but of recognition. She had not crafted this image out of fear. It was there. The mirror had told her so. She worked then with a clarity that surprised her. She took down the small family Bible that had lain on the shelf more as witness than guide, and she opened it to the page where her mother had pressed a sprig of thyme one summer to keep the scent of a garden within reach of winter. The thyme had browned to a delicate skeleton of itself, yet when she lifted it, a ghost of fragrance rose as if from far away. She placed the sprig upon the Antimacassar and spoke the psalm of protection in a voice even and low. The lace lay still beneath her hand. When she reached the last line, the sprig slid, not falling, but withdrawing to the chair seat as if the words had made the surface inhospitable. She went to the jar and took out the hairpin. She did not know why she had kept it, only that it belonged to the logic of the house now. She placed it at the upper edge of the lace, right of center, where a human head would anchor a veil. The air seemed to lean. The pin quivered and lay quiet, a black mark on a field of snow. She took a stitcher's chalk and drew a tiny cross upon the underside of the corner that always moved. Her hand shook, but the mark was true. When she stepped back, the room felt like a geometry weighted on by breath. The bowl of salted water caught a narrow beam of sun and scattered it in faint lines upon the floor. At noon Mrs. Hale came with a loaf still warm, her concern wrapped in practical talk. Ellen let her stand in the parlor because truth has need of witnesses. The older woman looked once, twice, and a third time at the Antimacassar, and then fixed her gaze upon the mirror instead, as if the glass were a more comfortable adversary. She said that an object sometimes carries a temper from a life not its own. She said that the veil some ladies wear can hold love or grief like a perfume in its threads. She said that a certain cousin of hers would not keep a lace collar in the house after her daughter died, for it seemed always to be damp at the throat. When she had said these things that were almost nothing and almost everything, she reached into her pocket and brought forth a little bottle of oil. A neighbor had given it to her long ago when the fever went through town. She had kept it out of habit. Ellen did not ask what flowers had yielded it. Mrs. Hale touched a drop to her finger and made a small sign in the air above the Antimacassar, not quite a blessing and not quite a warning. The house altered subtly, like a chord that finds a third note. Mrs. Hale pressed the loaf into Ellen's hands and departed without looking back. Toward evening the mirror began to weep. A slow film of moisture gathered and descended in patient tears that left clean tracks on the clouded surface. Ellen wiped them away with a corner of her apron, and they returned, always in the same places, as if the glass were remembering a face that had once fogged it from within. She set a dish beneath the frame to catch the drops. The bowl filled by the width of a fingernail and held a scent she could not place. Faint and troubling, a mingling of starch and old roses and the iron breath of blood touched by air. She covered the dish with a saucer and carried it to the kitchen, where she poured the water into the stove. The drops hissed faintly, and a pale sweetness rose that made her eyes prickle. When she returned, the mirror was clear and the Antimacassar lay serene, its center dark as the mouth of a well. Night collected in corners. She did not choose to sleep. She set the lamp high and sat with the Bible on her lap, not reading now but holding it as one holds the hand of an elder. The house was very quiet. The quiet itself made a sound like the pressure one feels before thunder. Close upon midnight, the chalked corner lifted. The little cross she had drawn rose and hung in the air, held by nothing, a bird that had forgotten to beat its wings. The hairpin rolled an inch and halted. The bowl beneath the chair thrummed like a struck glass, though nothing touched it. Ellen stood and the air cooled against her skin, a draft with no direction. She spoke then, not the words of ritual alone, but words of a woman addressing another woman. She said that the house belonged to the living. She said that grief had hours and days, and then must be folded and put away like winter clothes. She said that love must not make a prison of a room. She said that if a name needed saying, it might be said and then released. The lace shivered, the lamp flame bent and righted itself. From the attic a soft drag sounded, as of fabric drawn along a board. Ellen climbed while the sound continued, her feet finding the steps as if her body had known them longer than memory. The attic door gave with a sigh. The mirror on the floor showed the lamp as a broken sun. Upon the old trunk lay the folded scrap of paper where she had put the threads she gathered weeks ago. The paper had opened. The threads were arranged across the red cloak in a pattern that imitated the Antimacassar in miniature, a child's tracing of a parent's hand. At the center of this little net lay a brown stain, the color of tea dried in a saucer. It had a tied line. It had a shape like a fingertip pressed and held and taken away. She carried the cloak and the paper down to the parlor and spread them on the table beside the mirror. She set the lamp so that all three things could see one another. She waited. The sense of audience deepened until even the chair held itself like a person sitting upright to hear a verdict. Ellen unwound the red cloak, remembering in her hands the winter afternoons of girlhood when she had worn it for play, when her mother had called her in before dusk and fastened the clasp at her throat. The clasp was still there, a small oval of glass backed with foil that had dulled to a gentle dusk. She lifted it, and in the oval she saw a face that was not her own, not clearly, not as a portrait is clear, but as the memory of a face is clear when one looks into a window at night and the room behind holds flickering light. A woman not young, with the set mouth of one who has waited long past reason. Ellen felt the hair upon her arms stir. She did not look away. She took the hairpin and laid it upon the cloak beside the small net of threads. She took the chalk and drew a ring on the table around the little arrangement. She took the bowl from beneath the chair and poured a thin rim of salted water along the chalk ring, so that water and line and intention would keep what she meant to keep. Then she spoke again, more softly, as if to a guest who might be persuaded to rise without offense. She said there had been a loss in this house that had never been permitted to finish its falling. She said the lace had been the net that tried to catch it and hold it in place forever, and that such holding is a hurt to the living and the dead. She said she would help undo the knot if the one who dwelt within would let her hands learn the path of the thread. The Antimacassar lifted as if a wind had passed through it, though the air was still. The corner where she had made the chalked mark swung and pointed toward the attic stair, then toward the mirror, then toward the cloak, as if naming a triangle of importance. The bowl on the floor sang again and stilled. At the edge of the mirror a mist gathered and moved inward like a breath returned to a mouth. Ellen felt the moment one feels in a sick room when the fever breaks or climbs, the small pivot on which outcomes turn. She placed her fingertips very lightly upon the Antimacassar, just enough to feel the resistance of thread. She did not pull. She waited. The thread under her right forefinger drew taut of its own accord, then slackened, then drew again, as if inviting a rhythm. She answered, not with strength, but with agreement. The motion grew sure. A loop opened in the pattern like an eye unclosed after a long sleep. She worked until her shoulders ached. It was not sewing and not unpicking. It was a learned tracing, a rehearsing of paths. Now and then she lifted a corner and laid it precisely a fraction to the left, and in those moments the room would ease, as if a binding had given. Twice she felt a pressure on her hand that was companionable and sad, like the touch one makes upon a sleeve at parting when words would be too large for the space. Once she heard a voice that was not a voice say the simple syllable of thanks in the place, just behind hearing. She did not answer aloud. She let her hands answer. At last the face in the lace grew less certain, not gone, but loosened, like a reflection in water when a breeze begins. The hairpin slid back toward the jar. The chalk ring dried to a faint dust. The mirror shone with no tears upon it. Ellen sank back and breathed as if she had been beneath the surface too long. The lamp had burned low. Morning leaned its pale shoulder against the window. She closed the Bible without recalling when she had opened it. She stood, not trusting her knees, and carried the cloak to the stove. She did not burn it. She folded it and placed it in the lowest drawer of the sideboard, where useful things live. The little net of threads she put within an envelope and wrote upon it the word return, though she did not know to whom. That afternoon Stephen arrived without a letter to announce him, his face wind-cut, his eyes searching the rooms in a way a physician learns from houses as well as from bodies. He had taken an early train because sleep had refused him, and a sentence had risen in his mind with insistence. A sentence about sunlight that he had once offered without knowing why. He sat, hat in his hands, and listened while Ellen told him everything at last, not in a spill of terror, but in clear order, the way one reads a ledger before settling accounts. He did not smile, he did not scoff, he did not retreat behind the caution of a man who has a place in the world and will not be moved by shadows. He rose and went to the chair and stood before the Antimacassar with the same consideration he would give to a patient whose fever had turned. He said quietly that some maladies do not answer to the same cures that heal flesh, but that patience and light and the right kind of company will sometimes bring them to leave off. They kept vigil together that night. He read aloud from the Psalms with a voice that was steady without insistence. He told Ellen in an undertone a childhood memory of their mother working the lace by lamplight, counting beneath her breath, pausing now and then to lift a loop and ease it where it had tightened. Ellen felt a pulse of grief like a spring, old and clear. Stephen set the mirror in a slightly different place so that it did not accuse but accompanied. He asked Ellen to open the kitchen door just a little so that the house could breathe a line of outdoor air. He did no more than these simple things. Near midnight, the corner of the Antimacassar rose once and settled. A small sound came from the attic, the sound of something light being set down in a place that will keep it. The lamp did not bend. The bowl on the floor remained quiet. Stephen's shoulders eased as if a weight he had not named had shifted from him. In the gray hour before dawn, when even clocks seemed to hesitate, the Antimacassar relaxed in a way Ellen had not yet seen. The whiteness softened to a domestic meekness. The center, once the dark pit of the pattern, took the tender gray of dust in morning light. The suggestion of the face faded to the idea of a face one might find in clouds and tell oneself a story about and then forget while pouring tea. Ellen closed her eyes and laid a hand upon the lace as one touches a fevered brow that has cooled. The thread was neither cold nor warm. It was thread. She whispered a farewell she did not dramatize. Stephen rose and opened the curtain. The first clean stroke of the sun entered and fell upon the chair with the decency of a new day. They did not declare victory. They did not boast. They let the day go forward as if unremarkable. Ellen baked. Stephen repaired a loose hinge on the back door with more concentration than the task deserved, for busy work is a rite of gratitude. Clara came in the afternoon with her caution and her ribbon and her young will, and when she saw the parlor, she did not flee. She sat and told a story that took too many turns and laughed at her own confusion and knitted 3 neat rows. Mrs. Hale sent over a pie and pretended it was because she had made too many. The house took these offerings and settled upon them. That night Ellen folded the Antimacassar and set it in a drawer with care. She placed a plain linen cloth on the back of the chair, an honest square that would catch the oil of hair and the dust of days without ambition. She slept with her window open a little and dreamed not of veils and breath and faces, but of the steady sound of water found and kept in a jug. Close upon waking, she thought she heard, from the far room of the house where memory keeps its small light, the lightest footfall descending the attic stair. It had no weight to trouble the boards. It had only the rhythm of someone who has remembered their way home and does not need a mirror to find the door. The days that followed wore an unfamiliar lightness, as if the house itself had sighed and loosened its shoulders after years bowed beneath a burden. Ellen found herself pausing at the parlor threshold with a kind of astonishment, for the silence within no longer pressed against her. It was the silence of a lived-in room, a silence that held only the creak of wood, the faint sigh of curtains, the small gossip of the fire. She had folded the Antimacassar away, placed it beneath a layer of plain linens, and though her hand trembled at the drawer each time she touched it, the thing lay without motion. It was no longer an occupant of the household. It was an article, an object. Yet Ellen knew the battle had not ended merely by storing it. Objects remember. Objects wait. Stephen remained for a fortnight, delaying his return to the city under the pretense of minor ailments among his patients. He set his case on the hall table and gave his hours to small repairs, to walking the fields, to sitting with Ellen in the evenings when conversation was less necessary than presence. He admitted at last, in his careful way, that he had felt a peculiar oppression in the house during his first visit, though he had dismissed it as fancy. Now, he said, the air was altered, not only lighter but clearer, as if dust had been swept from a high window and new daylight poured through. Ellen smiled faintly at this and said she hoped the clarity would endure. Neither of them spoke the word curse, though both felt its shape in their thoughts. One evening Clara returned, hesitant at first, then more at ease as she found no strange motion in the parlor. She brought her knitting and a story about her cousin in town who had been offered work in a mill and was torn between wages and freedom. The girl's chatter filled the air with the simple sound of youth, and Ellen let herself listen without fear that the words were being overheard by something behind her. The lamp burned steadily. The curtains breathed with the winter air, and the chair in the corner sat modestly beneath its linen covering. Clara's hands grew quick again, her cheeks flushed with animation, and Ellen felt the thread of friendship mend itself stitch by stitch. When Clara departed that night, she paused only once to glance toward the drawer where the Antimacassar lay hidden, and her brow eased when she saw no sign of it. But the house did not release its strangeness so easily. There were nights when Ellen woke and fancied she heard the faintest creak upon the attic stair, a careful tread like one who remembers the boards that complain. At such times she lay still, neither praying nor fearing, but listening. Always the sound passed without entering her room. In the morning she found no disturbance, only the ordinary arrangement of furniture, the ordinary sheen of frost at the panes. She told herself that memories take longer to die than the things that birthed them, and perhaps the house itself was still loosening from the grip of what had dwelt within. At Stephen's urging, they did not leave the Antimacassar folded forever. He argued that objects shut away are objects given power by secrecy. Better, he said, to confront it openly, to see it as what it is, thread and pattern, no more. So one bright morning they drew it forth together and laid it upon the table. The whiteness was subdued now, the once radiant loops dulled to the common pallor of cloth long stored. The face that had stared from its weave was gone, replaced by nothing more than flowers and scrolls of an unremarkable design. Ellen's breath shook as she bent over it, but Stephen set a hand upon her arm and said quietly that the test of courage is not the vanquishing of fear, but the steadying of it. She nodded, and together they carried the lace outdoors. The snow was thin on the ground, brittle underfoot. They went to the back garden where the apple tree stood leafless and silent. Stephen fetched a spade and dug into the frozen earth until the soil yielded. They laid the Antimacassar within the narrow grave, folded once, then twice, like a garment made small for rest. Ellen sprinkled salt upon it, not with ritual but with conviction, and Stephen pressed the earth down firm. The spade rang dully against stone and root, sealing the burial. Ellen stood with her hands clasped and whispered words too soft for Stephen to hear. She did not speak farewell. She spoke only gratitude that the house might breathe again. When they returned indoors, the air was lighter still, as if the walls had listened and approved. After that, the days passed in gentler rhythm. Mrs. Hale resumed her visits, bustling as ever, her eyes sharper than her tongue. She praised Ellen's color, though the woman's face remained thin, and she remarked that the parlor seemed more cheerful than in months past. Ellen thanked her and offered tea, without flinching at the sound of the kettle. Clara came often, filling the house with youthful clatter. Even Stephen allowed himself moments of rest, stretched before the fire with a book half read upon his knees. For the first time in many weeks, Ellen felt laughter rise unbidden, not the brittle laughter of defiance, but the warm sound of life recognized and claimed. Yet in the quiet hours she did not forget. The memory of the Antimacassar lingered, a weight at the edge of thought. She would pass the parlor and recall the night it hovered at her bed, the sound of threads pulling in darkness, the face forming in the lace. She knew she would never entirely be free of it, but she also knew she had endured, and endurance is a form of victory. The house was hers again, and whatever presence had sought to dwell within it had been laid to rest, whether in the earth of the garden or in the deeper earth of the past. She could live now with her memories, for they were hers alone. When spring at last came, the apple tree bloomed white against the sky. Ellen stood beneath it, listening to the bees hum, and felt a peace she had not known in many months. The grave of the Antimacassar lay hidden beneath the roots, but no shadow marked the ground. She bent and touched the soil, cool and firm, and in her touch was both farewell and benediction. Then she rose and went indoors, the sound of her footsteps steady upon the boards, the sound of a woman who has faced her haunting and claimed her house once more. The first green came up in the furrows, and the road shed its winter iron for a kender temper, and with the change came letters that had been waiting somewhere between towns for ice to move. One bore a hand Ellen knew from childhood, the careful slope of Miss Pennington, who had kept the schoolroom neat and the children neater. She wrote that she had found among old papers a receipt for thread and a note in her mother's hand, a little list that spoke of thyme and oil and the use of white vinegar for setting color, and beneath the list, a line that said only that the lace is finished and the house is quiet. The date of that line matched the day she remembered as a child when the house had closed itself early, when their mother had gone to her room before supper, and the door had not opened to their calling for longer than seemed right. The note lay before her now like a stitch that had held too much. Ellen did not run to the garden as if the ground might be accused. She walked there as one goes to an errand that requires a steady hand. The apple tree had put out leaves at the ends of the black ones of branch, and the grass about the roots had gone soft with clover. She stood a while, letting her eyes learn the place again, and then she knelt and pressed her palm where the soil covered the folded thing. Nothing moved. No small tremor rose to meet her. She felt the even hum of life and no more. She said the line from the note under her breath, this time as a plain truth. The house is quiet. Weeks passed and quiet proved itself a habit rather than a trick. Stephen returned to the city and wrote in his next letter that patience will speak of pains born of weather, while neither of you nor of I will speak of those born of rooms, and I think, perhaps, we should. He said that he had watched a child sleep without fever and had thought of thread. He sent with the letter a small silver thimble that had belonged to their mother once. Its rim nicked where a needle had failed to be persuaded. Ellen placed it in the drawer beside the honest Lenin, and did not feel the old clutch of dread. It sat there like a relic that asks only to be remembered without being waked. Clara took to visiting at odd hours when errands sent her near, and sometimes she came with plans bursting from her like seed from a dry pod. She would plant beans along the fence and train them with string. She would boil orange peel with sugar and make a sweet to keep in a jar for days when the weather barked. She would help Ellen stitch new curtains for the bedroom that looked toward the quince. Ellen felt a prudent joy in these small collaborations, the kind that makes rooms rounder without cluttering them. The sound of Clara's laugh shook dust loose from corners where sorrow had laid it too thick. Even Mrs. Hale, who had seen more widowing and wintering than she liked to tell, admitted that the house now looked as a house should when it holds two women who have decided to let it live. Summer drew near. The apple tree wore its first fruit like green lanterns. There was one storm worth recording, a storm that walked out of the west with a gray hem that dragged low over fields, and for a brief hour the house held its breath, as if something large had approached and bowed at the threshold, and then chosen to pass by. The lightning wrote a few hot lines on the sky and ended its argument. The rain taught every surface its soft catechism. In the wake of that weather the air smelled, newly laundered, and old worries seemed too heavy to lift. Ellen put bowls out to catch drips that did not come and laughed at herself for her caution. That night she slept without waking, and in her sleep she dreamed not of lace or breath, but of a table laid for breakfast, and of hands setting down a dish, and of a chair that made no claim upon her except to hold her when she chose to sit. When the harvest was in its early promise and swallows were cutting their names into the dusk, Miss Pennington herself came to call, thinner than memory and sharper too. A needle of a woman whose thread had never broken. She carried a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. She said the parcel had been found in the school cupboard behind the ink bottles, and that she had not opened it because it had felt like a letter addressed to a house rather than to a person. Ellen took it with a care that was not fear, and when she undid the string the paper yielded a book her mother had kept when Ellen was yet small, a copybook where receipts shared pages with measures for skirts and notes about candle wax and the names of the women who had sent chicken and broth when sickness took a neighbor. Between two blank leaves lay a narrow strip of parchment folded upon itself. It bore a line in a hand Ellen recognized now almost painfully well. The line said what grief makes when hands refuse to be idle. That was all. They sat together a while, the schoolmistress and the woman once schooled, and spoke of the kind of learning that comes after the narrow desks and the slate. When the afternoon had lain down to rest itself, and the first little chill lifted from the floorboards, Miss Pennington rose and left with the simple blessing of old authority. Ellen held the copybook and understood that she had been reading the story of her own house, while thinking it was only a list of yeast and soap and sugar. She placed the book beside the thimble and felt that a certain circle had closed without noise. The last trial, if it can be called last when endings are shy creatures that seldom stand where we place them, came at the season's hinge where late summer leans upon early autumn and the air tastes of metal in the mornings. Ellen had woken early and gone to the parlor for the comfort of the first lamp. The linen on the chair had shifted in her absence from the night before, not with the slyness she had once known, but with the honest slide of cloth that has had a draft under it. She adjusted it and felt the old reflex of vigilance rise like a bird startled and remembered mid-flight that it need not fly. She smoothed the linen and saw that beneath it a seam of thread had loosened on the chair back, the upholstery giving notice in the mild way things give notice. She fetched her basket, and the needle found its path as sure as if the fabric had drawn it there. In that small work she felt the last knot yield, somewhere not under her hand, but in a room one step to the left of the visible. It was as if the house had waited for some honest mending to call home what had wandered far. From that day forward there were no creaks that did not belong to wood, no breaths pressed through cloth, no nights shaped like waiting. The apple tree dropped its fruit, fat with sweetness, and the bees buried their faces with the joy of their kind. Stephen wrote that he had found laughter returning to his practice like a patient who had walked farther than ever before and not faltered. He spoke of a widow who had let the drapes be drawn back after 3 years and of a clerk who had brought flowers into a room that had never allowed them. He did not claim connection. He offered it as a kinship of weather across roofs. Winter came mild, as if the weather too had chosen mercy. Ellen learned the contentments of the long season that are won rather than given. She and Clara made a pudding that one must stir a full 10 minutes to make the texture true. They learned to darn at a slant so that the sock would not rub. They read aloud and discovered that words live differently when the lamp is near. Mrs. Hale taught them to keep peels for vinegar and vinegar for glossing a table, and a table for teaching the young that the house holds more than food and sleep. Sometimes in the very stillness that only happens when snow keeps the road clean of wheels, Ellen would hear the faintest remembrance of thread in the room, not the cold pull of something that wants, but the warm whisper of fabric settling to new purpose. She allowed this and was not made uneasy by it. Memory itself had to have space, or it would begin again as hunger. In spring, Clara married a boy as steady as fence posts and came to sit in the parlor as a visitor with a ring that caught light like a small smile. She told stories that rose and fell, stories about the way a new house smells of wood when the sun strikes it, about a rooster that had opinions at the wrong hours, about a neighbor whose cat borrowed laps without invitation. Ellen listened and felt no jealousy of that new household. She felt only the quiet pride of a woman who keeps her room ready for the days when talk needs an older chair. Stephen, in time, found a woman to share his patient days, a woman who understood that at the edge of any diagnosis, there is always a place where hand holds hand and a look carries more medicine than bottles. They came to the house in summer and walked in the garden and admired the apple tree that had grown a little stronger each year since the burial. Stephen's wife asked very gently whether the house had always been so peaceful. Ellen said that peace is the kind of thing one grows in layers, and that some seasons are given mostly to planting and some to harvest, and that a house that sits long enough will hold both and remember which is which. Years, measured by pies cooled on windowsills and mending folded warm, gathered. The drawer where the thimble lay also held the copybook and the small envelope with the threads and the word return. On certain anniversaries, Ellen took them out, each in its turn, and gave them the respect that belongs to tools and to fragments and to confessions kept in small script. She did not go to the garden to stand over the place where the Antimacassar lay. There is a kind of faith that does not need to stand above old ground to know that the earth has done its work. When storms came, she counted cupboards and candles, not phantoms. When songs rose from the church, she let them enter her rooms without feeling watched by anything except the past, and the past had learned its temper. There was one last visitation, if such it can be called, on an afternoon when sun warmed the rails of the fence and children passed with hoops that made a sound like rings of water tossed upon water. Ellen sat in the parlor, the linen clean upon the chair, the ivy still willing in its glass bowl, and she felt a presence that was not foreign. It was the kind of presence a scent gives when one lifts the lid from a jar that has kept summer. It touched her shoulder without weight and bowed not her body, but her thought. In that bow she saw her mother's hands, patient, counting beneath breath, easing a loop, setting a thread. She did not turn to seek any face. She let the knowledge pass through her as light passes through clean water. When it had passed, there was no absence, only a fullness of the ordinary that felt like a promise kept. In the last season of her long dwelling, when her hair had thinned to a silver that matched the nicked rim of the thimble, Ellen taught a neighbor girl to crochet a simple square. She said that some patterns are best left plain. She said that beauty can be honest as a towel hung neat. She said that the hands should make what the heart can keep without debt. The girl, with all the pride of a first success, draped her small square upon the back of the chair and stepped back to admire. Ellen admired with her, and then folded the piece and laid it aside, not on that chair, but on another. She did not need to explain why. The room itself held the explanation, quiet as breath, when breath is only breath. The day came when she could not keep the steps without resting. She moved her bed to the room that knew the morning, and in that room she allowed the first light to find her each day. She kept the drawer close, though she did not open it often. When at last she felt the kind of weariness that is like an answer spoken after a question has been waiting a long time, she asked that the window be set a little open. The house gave its small voices to the yard, and the yard returned a few of its own, and between them lay the space where a life belongs. In that space Ellen rested. After she was gone, those who had loved her tended the rooms with the same care she had taught. Stephen came and stood in the parlor and laid his hand for a quiet minute upon the linen that covered the chair, and the act held no drama, only gratitude. He gathered the drawer's contents and tied them in a fresh cloth and kept them not as talismans but as history. Clara, older now, brought her own daughter to sit where she had once been a girl with too much ribbon and not enough patience. The child asked questions with the open curiosity that keeps houses honest. She asked why the chair wore linen and not lace, and Clara said that some chairs dress plainly because they have earned the right. The child accepted this and gave the chair a pat like one gives to a good animal, and the house took the gesture into itself. The apple tree gave a last abundance the year the house changed hands, as if to bless and to provide in the same act. The new family set their things down gently and noticed at once the light in the parlor. They were practical people, and they kept the practical habits that guard peace without making a ceremony of it. The chair remained where it had always kept best watch. Across it lay a cloth of some simple weave that knew washing and sun. On winter evenings the lamp burned steadily and bright, and the mirror learned new faces and did not weep. As for the Antimacassar, it lay in the earth where it had been put, thread and memory together in a place that will not give either back as they were. The ground above it took snow and rain and the small tread of the cat that believed every garden its own. Roots nosed through and around, unbothered by human meaning. In the seasons where the apple tree drank deep, there rose sometimes a sweetness in the fruit that had a distant echo of thyme and something like iron, though perhaps that is only the tongue's way of remembering tales told indoors. There were no breathings at windows, no faces in cloth, no corners lifted by hands that have no flesh. There was only life conducted with ordinary decency, which is the most stubborn answer to any haunting. If the house kept a secret, it was only this, that every room gathers what the living bring to it, and that sometimes the thread weaves more than pattern. It is not always the pattern that holds power. Sometimes it is the unweaving, done with patience and with light, that changes the air. Those who came after did not need to know the old crisis to benefit from its solution. They poured tea without glancing over their shoulders. They let children run the length of the hall, and the sound was no longer a tally of footsteps counted by something waiting. They sat at windows with mending and felt their thoughts settle to the measure of a needle passing through cloth. On the back of the chair the plain square did its work, taking the oil of hair and the dust of day and asking nothing in return. And so the story finished itself, not with a cry, but with the long patience of a house that has remembered how to be a house. The Antimacassar, once a net for grief, lay harmless in the soil, given back to a world that knows how to consume delicate things without malice. The faces that had loved and feared within the parlor had left their kindness in the wood, and their caution in the drawer, and their laughter in the air, where laughter lingers invisible. When the last of those who had known the old terror had grown gray, the tale remained as a whisper a house tells in sun, a reminder that what is made by hands can be untied by hands, and that the best endings are the ones that let the ordinary return and keep its place.